the frostbite cabin. It was the coldest winter in decades, and the snowstorm was unrelenting. Emily, a 26-year-old photographer, had been driving through the mountainous region, hoping to capture the beauty of the snow-covered wilderness. But as night fell, her car skidded on the icy road and slammed into a tree. The engine sputtered and died. With no cell signal and temperatures plummeting, Emily realized she needed shelter fast. She spotted a faint light through the dense woods and trudged toward it, her boots sinking into the snow. The light came from a small, weathered cabin, its windows glowing with a flickering orange light. She knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his face lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes sunken but alert. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Come inside before the storm takes you." Relieved, Emily stepped into the warmth of the cabin. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. The cabin was small but cozy, with old furniture and shelves lined with books and trinkets. "Thank you so much," Emily said, rubbing her frozen hands. "My car broke down, and I had nowhere to go." The old man didn't respond immediately. He closed the door and bolted it with a heavy iron latch. "Stay the night," he finally said, "but don't leave the cabin after dark. The snow hides things." Emily frowned but nodded, thinking the man was just being superstitious. She settled near the fire, sipping the hot tea he offered. As they sat in silence, she noticed strange carvings on the walls, symbols and runes she didn't recognize. "What are those?" she asked. "Protection," the old man said flatly. "From them." Emily's curiosity was piqued, but before she could ask more, the man stood and retreated to a small room, locking the door behind him. She was alone in the main room, the fire crackling softly. As the hours passed, the storm grew fiercer. The wind howled like a chorus of voices, and Emily thought she heard faint whispers beneath the noise. She tried to shake it off as her imagination, but then she heard a distinct knock at the door. Her heart raced. Who else would be out in this storm? She approached the door cautiously and peered through the frosted window. A figure stood outside, a woman in a tattered dress, her hair matted with ice. "Please," the woman said, her voice muffled by the wind. "Let me in. I'm freezing." Emily hesitated, remembering the old man's warning, but the woman looked so helpless. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the door. The moment the door opened, the woman lunged forward, her eyes black as coal. Emily screamed and stumbled back, but the figure stopped at the threshold, as if invisible chains held her in place. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the old man's voice boomed from behind. He stood there, holding a rusted axe, his face pale with fear. The woman outside snarled, her voice distorting into an inhuman growl. "You can't keep us out forever, old man." The old man slammed the door shut and began chanting in a language Emily didn't understand. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the whispers outside grew louder, more insistent. "They're the frostbitten," the old man explained, his voice trembling. "Spirits of those who died in the cold, cursed to wander these woods. They lure the living to join them." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier? I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to open the door." The night was a blur of terror. The frostbitten clawed at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their voices pleading and mocking. The old man's chants kept them at bay, but Emily could see the strain on his face. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the spirits vanished with the first rays of sunlight. The old man slumped into a chair, exhausted. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." Emily didn't argue. She grabbed her things and left the cabin, the old man's warnings echoing in her mind. As she trudged back to the road, she glanced back at the cabin one last time. The light in the window flickered out, and the forest was silent once more. When she reached her car, she found it covered in frost. On the windshield, written in the ice, were the words, "We'll see you again, Part 2, The Return of the Frostbitten." Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread as she drove away from the cabin. Though the storm had passed, the forest seemed eerily quiet. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see something or someone following her. By the time she reached the nearest town, the sun was high, and the snowy streets bustled with life. She checked into a small motel, her mind replaying the night's events. Was it real? Were the frostbitten truly spirits? Or had she hallucinated everything in the midst of panic and exhaustion? That night, Emily fell into a restless sleep. Her dreams were plagued by images of the woman at the cabin door, her black eyes piercing, and her icy breath forming chilling words. "We'll see you again." She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The room felt unusually cold. The heater was on, but the air had a strange, biting chill. When she looked at the window, she froze. Written in the frost on the glass was a single word: "Come." Emily's breath hitched. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe condensation had formed patterns, or someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, she knew the truth. They hadn't let her go. Desperate for answers, Emily drove to the town's library the next morning. She scoured old records and local legends about the area. After hours of searching, she found a faded newspaper article from 1978. The headline read, "8 hikers vanish in blizzard, only one survivor." The article described a group of hikers who had been caught in a brutal snowstorm near the same forest. When rescuers found the sole survivor, he was delirious, babbling about spirits that whispered promises of warmth and safety before dragging his friends into the storm. The survivor later took his own life, leaving behind a single note: "The frostbitten never forgive." Emily's blood ran cold. The story mirrored her experience. She realized the old man at the cabin must have been the survivor, now living in self-imposed exile, trying to keep the spirits at bay. That evening, as Emily returned to her motel, the wind picked up, carrying with it faint whispers. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the darkened street. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Emily, come back." Her stomach churned. How did they know her name? She hurried inside, locking the door and closing the curtains. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to seep through the walls, growing more insistent. Suddenly her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "We're waiting." Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. The text was accompanied by a photo, a blurry image of the cabin, its door slightly ajar, with shadowy figures standing in the snow. Emily knew she couldn't ignore the frostbitten. She had opened their door, broken the old man's warning, and now they had latched onto her. The only way to escape was to confront them. She packed her things and drove back to the forest, the storm clouds gathering once more. By the time she reached the cabin, night had fallen, and the wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls. The cabin door was wide open, and the fire inside burned unnaturally bright. Emily hesitated at the threshold, remembering the old man's chants and the protective symbols. But before she could step inside, the door slammed shut, and the whispers turned into screams. Emily turned to run, but the snow beneath her feet shifted unnaturally. Hands Icy, skeletal hands burst from the ground, grabbing at her ankles. She screamed, struggling to free herself as the frostbitten emerged from the snow, their faces twisted with malice. "You brought this upon yourself," one of them hissed, their voice like the crackling of ice. "Join us, or face the storm." Emily's mind raced. She remembered the old man's words. "The symbols protect you." Frantically, she pulled out her pocket knife and began carving one of the runes she had seen into the wooden handle of her flashlight. The frostbitten hesitated, their black eyes narrowing. Emily took the chance to break free and ran toward the cabin. She slammed her fist against the door, screaming for the old man. The door opened, and he yanked her inside, bolting it shut once more. "You shouldn't have come back," the old man growled, his face a mask of anger and fear. "They won't stop," Emily panted. "I had no choice." The old man sighed and grabbed a dusty leather book from a shelf. "If you want to end this, you'll have to help me. The frostbitten are bound to this place by an ancient curse. To break it, we must burn their remains buried beneath the snow." Emily's stomach turned. "Their remains? How do we even find them?" "They'll lead us to them," the old man said grimly. "But it's a trap. They'll do everything they can to stop us." Part 3. The Hunt for the Frostbitten. The old man handed Emily a small, rusted lantern. Its glass was etched with protective runes, and the flame inside flickered an unnatural blue. "This will guide us to their graves," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But once we're out there, they'll come for us. Stay close, and don't let the flame go out. If it does, we're as good as dead." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm outside raged, the wind howling like an animal in pain. As they stepped out of the cabin, the lantern's flame flared brighter, casting an eerie glow on the snow-covered ground. The old man led the way, muttering chants under his breath. The runes carved into the lantern seemed to repel the whispers, but Emily could still feel the frostbitten watching them from the shadows. After what felt like hours, the lantern's light flickered and shifted, casting its glow on a mound of snow. The old man stopped and pointed. "There," he said. "Their remains are beneath this spot." Emily hesitated. The snow seemed unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath. She knelt and began digging with her gloved hands, the icy cold biting into her skin. As she unearthed the ground, a skeletal hand emerged, its fingers curled as if frozen in agony. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, more aggressive. The frostbitten appeared, their ghostly forms circling the pair. "You won't take what's ours," one of them hissed, their voice sharp and cold. The old man raised his lantern, its blue flame blazing. The spirits recoiled, but their anger was palpable. "Hurry," he shouted to Emily. "We need to burn them now." Emily pulled a canister of kerosene from her bag, pouring it over the remains. She fumbled with a lighter, her fingers trembling as the frostbitten closed in. One of them lunged, its icy claws slashing at her arm. She cried out in pain but managed to ignite the fuel. The fire roared to life, and the spirit let out an ear-piercing scream as it dissolved into the night. The other frostbitten shrieked in rage, their forms becoming more solid as they prepared to attack. The old man stepped forward, chanting louder. The symbols on his lantern flared, creating a barrier of light around them. "Emily, there are more graves. The curse won't break until they're all burned." As they moved to the next grave, Emily shouted over the storm, "Why are they like this? What happened to them?" The old man hesitated before answering. "They were betrayed. Years ago, during a blizzard, The villagers locked them out of their homes, fearing they carried sickness. They froze to death in the storm, their hatred binding them to this place. Now they seek revenge on anyone who enters their domain. Emily's stomach churned. So they're victims and monsters? The old man nodded grimly. That's the nature of curses. Pain breeds more pain. They reached the last grave, just as the storm intensified. The frostbitten attacked relentlessly, their claws slicing through the air. Emily and the old man fought them off with the lantern's light and the protective runes, but their strength was waning. As Emily dug into the snow, her hands hit something hard. She uncovered a skull, its hollow eyes staring back at her. The whispers turned into screams, and the frostbitten lunged as one, desperate to stop her. The old man threw himself in front of Emily, holding the lantern high. "Do it now," he shouted. Emily poured the kerosene and lit the fire. The flames erupted, consuming the skull and the spirits with it. The frostbitten let out one final deafening scream before vanishing into the storm. The wind died down, and the forest fell silent. Emily collapsed to her knees, exhausted. The old man stood beside her, his face lined with relief. "It's over," he said softly. "The curse is broken." As they made their way back to the cabin, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. The frostbitten were gone, their souls finally at rest. The next morning, as Emily prepared to leave, the old man handed her the lantern. "Take this," he said. "It's a reminder of what happened here, and a warning. There are more curses in the world than you can imagine. Be careful where you tread." Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the runes on the glass. As she drove away, the snow-covered forest seemed less menacing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, some part of the frostbitten, still lingered, watching her. When she glanced at her rearview mirror, she saw faint words forming in the frost. "Thank you, Part 4. The Unseen Watchers." Weeks passed since Emily's harrowing encounter with the frostbitten. She had returned to her life, trying to put the nightmare behind her. The chilling memories of the cabin, the storm, and the eerie whispers seemed to fade into the background, but something still felt off. At night, when the wind howled outside her apartment, she would wake, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still hear the faint whispers of the frostbitten, always just out of reach, calling her name. One evening, while sitting at her kitchen table, Emily noticed something strange. A thin layer of frost had formed on her window, despite the warm temperature inside. The frost was growing rapidly, and as it spread, words began to form. "You thought we were gone." Her blood ran cold. Emily rushed to the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, etched into the frost, was the unmistakable shape of a handprint. It was identical to the ones she had seen at the cabin. The frostbitten were not gone. They were still with her. The next few days were filled with dread. Emily found that wherever she went, the temperature seemed to drop around her. At work, the office would grow unnaturally cold, her breath visible in the air. In the middle of meetings, the frost would appear on her phone's screen, and when she looked away, the words would change. "You are ours." No matter what she did, the cold followed. It was as if the frostbitten were pulling her back into their world. Emily couldn't escape them. In desperation, she reached out to the old man. She knew that if anyone could help, it was him. The old man answered on the second ring. His voice was weary, tinged with the same dread that had filled it when she first met him. "They're following you," he said, as if he had expected her call. "I warned you. The frostbitten's curse doesn't end just because you burned their remains. They don't forgive easily. You've opened a door, Emily, and now they want you to stay." Emily's hands shook as she clutched the phone. "What do I do? How do I make them leave?" "You must return to the cabin," he replied. "You need to sever the bond. There is a ritual, one that only works if you go back to where it all began. The frostbitten can't be fully banished until the source of their curse is destroyed." Without another word, Emily packed her bags and made her way back to the forest. This time, the journey felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, the storm clouds gathering once more. As she drove down the winding road, her mind raced. Would she survive this time? Would she ever be free of the frostbitten? The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, just as she remembered it. But now, it seemed darker, more menacing. The door creaked open before she could even touch the handle, as if welcoming her back. Inside, the fire in the hearth had been reignited. The room was colder than it should have been, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. Emily stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The old man was waiting for her, his face pale and drawn. "You've returned," he said softly. "This is your last chance, Emily. If we fail, they'll claim you forever." The old man handed Emily a small, worn book. Its pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations. "This is the only way," he explained. "We must burn the last remnants of their spirits. We must destroy the source of their anger, this cabin." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She had no choice. The frostbitten were closing in, their icy presence creeping through the walls, their whispers growing louder. Together they began the ritual, chanting the incantations from the book. The flames in the hearth grew higher, casting an eerie glow over the room. The frostbitten's whispers became screams, their anger filling the cabin. Suddenly, the ground shook, and the frostbitten materialized before them, their skeletal forms glowing with an unnatural light. They lunged at Emily, but the old man stood between them, holding the book high. "The curse ends here," he shouted. With a final forceful chant, the old man threw the book into the fire. The frostbitten screamed, their forms flickering and twisting. The cabin seemed to come alive, the walls cracking and groaning as if they, too, were trying to escape. Emily felt the air grow heavy, the temperature plummeting. The frostbitten surged forward, but the flames of the fire roared to life, consuming them. Their bodies twisted into dark, shadowy figures before being consumed by the inferno. As the fire died down, the room fell silent. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight of the frostbitten's presence lifted. Emily collapsed to the floor, exhausted. The old man knelt beside her, his face pale but relieved. "It's over," he whispered. "They're gone for good." Emily looked around the cabin. It was no longer the dark, oppressive place it had once been. The cold had lifted, and for the first time, the forest seemed peaceful. The curse was finally broken. But as Emily stepped outside into the crisp, cold air, she glanced back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow in the window, watching her, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if the frostbitten had truly been destroyed, or if they had simply learned to wait.